There are men who measure a person by what they can give back. My grandfather was one of them. He kept a ledger the way other men keep a Bible, and in that ledger every kindness had a column, every debt a due date. I inherited the ledger. I inherited the habit. And for the longest part of my life, I believed the world could be balanced like an honest set of books, that if you were careful and cold and counted right, you would never be the one left holding a loss. Then a woman came up my road in the worst summer this valley ever knew. She had walked 40 miles on feet that had stopped bleeding only because there was nothing left to bleed. She had a child on her back who no longer cried, which is a thing that will hollow you out if you let yourself think on it too long. She stood at the edge of my yard where the dust met the shade, and she did not ask for anything. She had learned, somewhere between wherever she started and my gate, that asking got you hurt. I know now what she was bracing for. She thought I would raise my voice, or my rifle, or worse, that I would be polite about it, the way cruel men are polite when they turn you away. She had every reason in the record of that whole country to expect it. What I said to her that afternoon changed the arithmetic of my entire life, and I have spent every year since trying to understand whether I did a good thing, or a selfish one, or whether those two are as separate as I used to believe. Stay with me. This is not the story I would have told you when I was younger. I've had to unlearn too much for that. The dog knew before I did. Old Rel was a cattle dog gone mostly deaf, and by that summer he slept more than he worked. But that afternoon he came up off the porch board stiff-legged and pointed his nose at the road with a low sound in his chest that I hadn't heard in 2 years. I set down my pencil. I remember that clearly. I was doing the July accounts, and the numbers were ugly, and I was almost glad of the excuse to stop looking at them. The drought had been on us since April. You have to understand what that word means out here, because in a town it means a brown lawn and a raised water bill. On my land it meant the creek had shrunk to a string of green pools, and the string was breaking, and I had already sold 19 head at a loss because I couldn't water them and couldn't watch them die slow. The grass had gone the color of old paper. When the wind came, it carried grit that got into your teeth, your eyes, the seams of your clothes, the butter. Everything tasted faintly of the ground. So when Rel pointed, my first thought was trouble, because in a bad year trouble is the only thing that travels. I went to the door with the accounts pencil still behind my ear, and I looked down the road and I saw her. She was maybe 200 yards out, coming slow, and even at that distance I could tell she was near the end of something. She didn't walk so much as fall forward and catch herself, over and over, a woman made entirely out of the will to take one more step. There was a bundle high on her back, wrapped and slung the way you'd carry a child. She had a blanket over her shoulders despite the heat, and I understood later that the blanket was the whole of what she owned. I want to tell you I felt compassion in that first moment. I didn't. I want to be honest with you the way my grandfather taught me to be honest with a ledger, which is the only honesty I ever fully trusted. What I felt first was calculation. I saw a mouth I couldn't feed. I saw water I didn't have. I saw a complication walking up my road in a summer that had no room for one, and some low-practice part of me was already rehearsing the words a careful man says. I've nothing to spare. There's a town 9 miles east. God keep you. Polite. Final. The door closing soft so you can tell yourself you weren't unkind. She stopped at the edge of the yard. Not in it. At the very edge, where the last of the porch shade fell across the dust, as if she'd measured to the inch how close she was allowed to come. And she stood there and she waited, and she did not say a word, and that the not tasking is the thing that reached in and turned something over in my chest. Because I knew that stance. I'd seen it on men who'd been beaten so regular they'd stopped flinching and started simply standing still to get it over with. She wasn't waiting for help. She was waiting for the blow, and standing straight so it wouldn't be said she'd cringed. Up close she was younger than the walk had made her, though her face was so cracked with dust and sun that age didn't rightly apply. Apache. I knew that much from the cut of her, the moccasins worn through to the shape of her feet, the silver at her ears that she still wore though it would have bought her food a dozen times over, which told me something about her before she'd said a word. Her eyes were the steady kind. They looked at me and took my measure and expected the worst, and were prepared to receive it without complaint. The bundle on her back was a child. I could see now the small hand hooked in the blanket's fold. The child was not crying. In a healthy child that far past its patience, the silence was the worst sign of the lot, and I think we both knew it, and I think it was the one thing on this earth she could not hold her composure against, because when my eyes went to the child her jaw moved once, a small betraying tremor, quickly stilled. "Water," she said. "Not please, not sir." Just the word laid down flat, because she'd spent whatever she had on the walk and there wasn't enough left in her for softening it. Here is where I'm supposed to tell you my heart opened. It didn't, not clean and not all at once. What happened was more of a war, and it was quick and it was quiet and it took place entirely behind my face. On one side stood the ledger, and the ledger was not wrong. I couldn't feed another 2 mouths, and there'd be talk in town. And there was a real chance that being seen to take in an Apache woman in that particular year in that particular county would cost me in ways money doesn't cover. My grandfather had built this place out of exactly the sort of caution that turns a stranger away. On the other side stood nothing I could have named. Just a small hand hooked in a blanket, and a woman standing at the edge of my shade with her chin up, ready to be refused. I went to the trough and worked the pump and filled the dipper, and I carried it to her, and she drank in a way I'd only seen in animals brought back from dying, deep and desperate, and then, with a discipline that startled me, stopping. She stopped with the dipper half full. She turned and reached back over her shoulder and got the child's mouth to the water, and only when the child had taken what it could did she finish the rest herself. Last. She put herself last, with a body that plainly had nothing left to give, and something in me that had been doing arithmetic all my life just quit, set down its pencil. "There's a town," I started to say, because the words were already loaded, because a lifetime of caution fires whether you aim it or not. She nodded. She'd heard that sentence before, in 100 yards and 100 doors. She was already turning. And I heard myself say, "It'll kill the 2 of you before dark." She stopped. 9 miles, no water on the road in that sun. I don't know where the words were coming from. They weren't from the ledger. The boy won't make it, you know that. You've known it since the last place turned you off. Her chin came up a fraction. Not defiance. Something harder to look at. It was the face of a person deciding whether hope is a thing they can any longer afford to feel, because hope that gets denied costs more than despair that never lifted its head. "I've a well," I said, "in a barn that's dry and out of the wind. And I was about to make a poor supper for 1 man, that'll stretch to 3 if nobody's proud about the portions." She looked at me for a long moment. I have thought about that look for the rest of my life. She was reading me for the trick in it, because there is always a trick. In the world she came from there is always a price named later, and it is usually the worst kind of price. She was a young woman alone. She had every reason to hear an offer of shelter as the opening move of something ugly. I understood that, standing there, in a rush that shamed me. And so I said the only thing I could think of that might carry the truth of it. "You'll sleep in the barn with the door barred from the inside. There's a bolt. I put it on myself years back. You bar it and you keep the bar, and nobody comes near you that you don't want near you, and that's God's own promise from a man whose grandfather made him swear on the accounts never to lie in a bargain. I heard how strange that must sound. I don't know how to make an oath except by the books, but I mean it by them." Something in her face moved. It wasn't trust. Trust was too far gone in her for a stranger to buy back in one afternoon. But it was the willingness to gamble, which for a person in her state is a braver thing than trust, because trust assumes a good outcome and she was assuming nothing. "I'll take you," I said. And then, because her eyes narrowed at the phrase, because take is a word that has meant terrible things to women in her position, and I heard it the second it left me, I fixed it. I mean, I'll take you in, feed you, water you, ask you nothing. And in the morning, if you want gone, I'll fill your skins and point you at the mountains and never say a word about which way you went. And I smiled. I don't know why I smiled. I'm not a smiling man. The ledger doesn't smile. But something about having finally, for once in my counted life, thrown my own arithmetic out the window made me feel light in a way I hadn't in years, and it came out of me as a smile before I could stop it. She'd braced for a door. She got a smile and I'll take you in, and I watched the bracing go out of her body an inch at a time. The way a rope pays out under strain, not slack, never all the way slack, but no longer at the breaking point. Her name was Nashoba. She told me that night, by the fire I built low in the yard because the house was too hot and the barn too dark for a first evening, and because I understood without being told that she'd want to see the country around her and know the exits. The boy was called Little Bird, though that was a soft English shape she gave his real name for my tongue's sake. He was 4. He'd stopped talking somewhere on the road, she said, in the plain way she said everything, and hadn't started again. I looked at the small, silent boy turning a smooth stone over in his fingers by the firelight, and I felt the ledger try to open in my mind. How long? How much? What's the cost of this? And for the first time in my adult life, I closed it myself and set it aside. I told her she and the boy could stay till the drought broke. It surprised me even as I said it. She looked at me across the fire with those steady eyes and said, "Why?" Not a question, the way she said it. A challenge. She wanted to know the price because she'd learned there is always a price, and the ones who won't name it are the ones to fear. I didn't have a good answer. I still don't, entirely. So I told her the truth, which was the only currency I trusted. "I've been alone out here 11 years, I said. "I keep books on everything: cattle, feed, rain, debts. There's a column for every kind of gain and every kind of loss, and I've balanced them all my life, and this spring I looked at the whole account and I couldn't tell you what the sum was for." I turned my hands over, empty, in the firelight. "You walked up my road today and I felt something I don't have a column for. I'd like to find out what it is before I turn it away. That's the whole of my reason, and it's a selfish one, so you needn't feel you owe me for it." She was quiet a while. The fire ticked. Out past the light, my starving cattle shifted and lowed. "You're a strange man," she said at last. "So the record shows," I said. And for the first time, barely, a crack in a wall, gone as soon as it came, the corner of her mouth moved, and I understood I'd made an Apache woman who'd walked 40 miles out of hell come very near to a smile, and I wrote nothing in any book that night, and slept better than I had in a year. The trouble started, as trouble in a small county always does, with a man on a good horse who had nothing better to do than mind another man's business. His name was Coyle. He ran the freight line and held paper on half the valley, and he'd wanted my south quarter for 6 years because it had the only spring that never fully failed, even that summer. He came up my road 11 days after Nashoba did, and he found her in the yard, hanging wet wash on the line, because by then she'd taken over the well and the wash and half the work of the place, not because I asked, but because idleness sat wrong on her, and because, I think, work was the one language she trusted to say, "I am not taking your charity for free." Coyle sat his horse and looked at her a long time, and then he looked at me, and he smiled the smile of a man who has just been handed a lever. "Didn't figure you for the type," he said. "I'm not any type you've got a name for," I said. "State your business or water your horse and move on. I've work." "My business," he said, "is that folks talk. And folks are going to talk about a white man keeping an Apache and her whelp out here alone in a year when 3 ranches north of here got burned by her people." He let that sit. "I'd hate to see talk turn to something worse. Man alone, no witnesses, a bad element on his land. Accidents happen in a dry season." I understood him perfectly. It wasn't a warning. It was a price named at last, the way Nashoba had known a price would eventually be named. Give up the South Quarter and the spring, and the talk stays talk. Keep it, and the talk becomes men with torches some night when the wind was up. I have to tell you about the war that went on in me then, because it's the heart of this whole thing. The ledger man I'd been my whole life did the sum instantly, and the sum was plain. Two strangers I'd known 11 days against everything my grandfather and I had built in a lifetime. It wasn't even close by the arithmetic. Any careful man alive would have told Nashoba that night gently that it had gotten too dangerous, filled her skins as promised, and pointed her at the mountains, and slept with a clear conscience and a whole ranch. That was the balanced answer. That was the columns worked honest. And I stood there in my own yard, and discovered that I would rather burn than do it. I didn't say anything grand to Coyle. Grand words are cheap, and he'd have known them for fear dressed up. I just said, the spring's not for sale, wasn't last year, isn't now. And the woman's a hired hand on my place, wages and all, and if any accident comes to my hired hands, I'll know exactly whose horse to look for, and so will the marshal at Canyon, who owes me a favor and hates you worse than I do. Most of that was a lie. The marshal owed me nothing and probably didn't know my name, but Coyle didn't know that, and a bluff run flat and cold reads truer than an honest man's tremor. He looked at me a while longer, then he turned his horse. At the road he stopped and said, "You'll regret her," and he was gone in his own dust. Nashoba had heard all of it. She stood by the wash line with a wet shirt in her hands, and when I turned to her, her face had closed up again. All that inch-by-inch easing of the past 11 days snapped shut. The wall rebuilt in a breath, because she'd just heard, in Coyle's mouth, the confirmation of everything she'd braced for on that first day. That she was a danger. That kindness to her had a cost, and the cost was coming for a man who'd been fool enough to be kind. "I'll go tonight," she said. "The boy's strong enough now. You've done more than—" "You'll do no such thing," I said. "He'll burn you out." She said it flatly, a fact off her ledger, and hers was written in worse ink than mine. "I've seen it. In the North. Men who took us in and were burned for it. They're women. They're children." Her voice didn't shake, but her hands on the wet shirt were white at the knuckle. "I won't be the reason a good man loses everything. I've been that reason. I won't be it again." And there it was, the weight she'd been carrying that was heavier than the boy on her back. She'd already lived this once. Someone had already been destroyed for the crime of not turning her away. That was the ghost she walked with, and it was why she'd stood at the very edge of my shade that first day, close as she dared and no closer, so that when I refused her, the refusing would cost me nothing. I want to be careful here, because this is the emotionally heaviest hour of the whole account, and I've never known how to weigh it. I could have let her go. Everything sensible said let her go. She was offering to release me from a debt I'd taken on in a reckless afternoon, and a wiser man would have taken the release with gratitude. If I'd let her walk into the mountains that night, I'd have kept my ranch, kept my safety, kept the clean books my grandfather died proud of. But I'd have lost the only thing I'd found in 11 years that I couldn't balance and didn't want to. And I understood, standing in that yard, that a life kept safe by turning away everything that mattered was exactly the sum I'd stared at in April and couldn't find the purpose of. That was the whole rotten answer to the question that had been eating me. I'd balanced my whole life by never letting anything cost me. And it had come to nothing, because a thing that costs you nothing is worth nothing, and I was 43 years old learning it in a drought. "Nashoba," I said, "look at me. You are not going to be the reason I lose anything. You're going to be the reason I finally have something. There's a difference, and I need you to believe it even if you can't feel it yet." She shook her head. "You don't know what he'll do." "No," I said, "but I know what I'll do, and I'm not made to turn you off. I found that out 11 days ago, and I've made my peace with the cost of it, whatever the cost turns out to be. That's my decision to make, and I've made it. Yours is only whether you'll let me make it, or whether you'll rob me of it by running off in the dark, and leaving me to wonder the rest of my life whether I was a coward at the end. That reached her. I don't fully know why. Maybe because I'd framed it as her taking something from me rather than sparing me, because a woman that proud could refuse charity forever but couldn't stand to be a thief. She stayed. The weeks that followed were the strangest and best of my life, and I'll not pretend the strain wasn't always there. A low note under everything, the knowledge that Coyle was out past the ridge doing his same as I did mine. But something was growing on that ranch that I'd never had, and it grew despite the fear, maybe because of it, the way the toughest grass comes up in the poorest ground. Little birds started talking again. Not to me, I was too big and too strange, and my voice was too much like the men who'd hunted his mother, but to Rel, the old deaf dog, whom he followed everywhere, and to whom he confided long grave secrets that the dog received with great dignity, being unable to hear a word of them. Then one evening the boy said something to me. I'd carved him a small horse out of cottonwood badly because I've no gift for it, and he took it and turned it over and said a word in Apache, and Nashoba's breath caught, and she told me it meant ugly, and then she laughed, actually laughed, a sound I'd not once heard from her, and said the boy meant it kindly, that among her people an ugly horse was a lucky one, and I have kept that ugly horse on my mantle for 30 years, and it is the finest thing I own. We learned each other. She taught me which of the summer plants would still bear water in a drought, knowledge that saved my last cattle and that no white man in that county had. I taught her the accounts because she asked, because she decided a woman alone in a white man's country had better understand how his numbers worked. And she took to the ledger faster than I ever had, and found 2 errors in my July figures that I'd have sworn were sound. And one night late by the low fire she told me about the North, about the ranch that took her in, about the family that had been kind, about the night the men came and what she'd carried out of the fire on her back and what she'd had to leave in it. She told it flat and dry, no tears, because she'd cried that well empty long before she reached my road. But when she was done she looked at me and she said, "That is the cost of keeping me. You should know exactly what it is that you have decided to risk." And I said, "I've written it in the book, under my own name, and I've balanced it and I find I can bear it." She looked at me a long time across the fire. "You are still a strange man," she said. "Getting stranger by the week," I agreed. But I saw that the wall, this time, had not gone all the way back up. And out past the ridge, I knew, Coyle was waiting for his dry season to give him the wind he needed. The wind came in September, and Coyle came with it. I'd known it would be fire, and I'd known it would be night, and so for weeks I'd done the only preparation a careful man can do, which was to stop being only careful. I'd cut a wide fire break around the barn and the house, plowed it down to bare dirt, because the ledger man in me had finally learned to spend when spending was the sum that mattered. I'd moved the last cattle up to the high spring. I'd taught Nashoba where the deed and the money were buried in case, and I'd taken to sleeping light, with the window open to the wind. So I was awake when deaf old Rel came up off the floor pointing at the dark, the same stiff-legged point he'd given the day she came, and I smelled it before I saw it. Smoke, and under the smoke coal oil. They'd fired the far grass, upwind, meaning for the wind to carry it into the house while they sat safe on the ridge and watched a strange man and his bad element burn. 3 of them I found out after. Coyle and 2 he'd paid. They'd reckoned on a man alone, panicking, running out into the light where a rifle could find him. They hadn't reckoned on the fire break, and they hadn't reckoned on her. I'm going to tell the next part plainly, because it's the hinge of everything and it deserves no decoration. The fire came fast and it came wide, and the fire break held the worst of it, but a spark carries where it will, and one caught the barn roof, and the barn was where little bird slept. I went for the boy. Nashoba went for the horses, because she'd made the same calculation I had in the same half-second and known that if we lost the horses we lost any chance of the high country, and one of us had to think past the next 5 minutes even with a child in the fire. She trusted me to get her son. Understand what that means. This woman, who had trusted no one since the North, who had barred a door against me the first 11 nights, ran away from her burning child because she trusted me to carry him out. There is no larger thing one person can hand another. I've never been handed anything like it before or since. I got the boy. He was awake and silent, of course silent. Silence was his whole language for terror, and he clung to my neck, and I came out through smoke with my eyes streaming and my grandfather's ledger. God help me, tucked in my shirt, because I'd grabbed it in the dark on pure animal instinct. 11 years of habit reaching past the fire. And Coyle was in the yard. He'd come down off the ridge. I think the fire break had spoiled his plan and spoiled his patience, and he'd come to finish it by hand. He had a pistol and he had it on me, and I was standing in the light of my own burning barn with a child in my arms and no way to reach the rifle, and I saw in his face the sum he'd come to collect. "Told you you'd regret her," he said. "Here is the morally heavy thing, and I've turned it over for 30 years and never gotten it to balance." Nashoba came out of the dark behind him with the axe from the woodpile. She had a clear stroke. He never heard her, the fire was too loud, the wind too high. She could have ended him and saved us all, and no court in that county would ever have known or cared, and it would have been just, by every honest reckoning of what he'd come to my land to do. I saw her there, axe raised in the firelight, and I saw her face, and I saw the decision go across it. And I want you to know that I do not know to this day whether what she did was mercy or something harder to name. She didn't strike him. She swung the flat of it hard into the back of his gun hand, and the pistol went into the dark, and Coyle screamed and turned. And by then I had the boy set down and I was on him, and it was over quick and ugly and without anyone dying, which is more than he'd have given us. Afterward the barn a ruin, the house saved by the fire break. Coyle's 2 hired men fled the second it turned. Coyle himself trussed with wash line for the marshal I'd once only bluffed about. Afterward I asked her. I said, "Why didn't you?" She knew what I meant. She looked at the axe, still in her hand, and then she set it down against the woodpile very carefully, as if it were hot. "Because you keep a book," she said. I didn't understand. "You keep a book of everything," she said, "every debt, every cost, and you decided to carry me on it anyway when the sum said not to. You wrote me under your own name and said you could bear it." She looked at me, and her face in the last light of the fire was the steadiest I ever saw it. "If I killed him, I'd have written a thing on your book that you'd carry the rest of your life. A dead man on the land of the one man who was ever only kind to me. I've been the reason a good man was destroyed. I won't be the reason a good man is damned." She looked at the ruined barn, at her son alive in the dirt clutching an ugly cottonwood horse. "You balanced your book to keep me. I balanced mine to keep you. I have never in my life had less to say." She and the boy did not go into the mountains. I'd like to tell you the county came around, that Coyle's arrest changed hearts, that we lived easy after. Some of that came, slow, over years, in the grudging way that country changes. The marshal turned out to be real and turned out to hate Coyle honestly. And the talk turned. And a hard winter after the drought put a great many proud men in a position to be glad of a neighbor who shared what he had. And Nashoba's knowledge of the land made my ranch the one that came through when others didn't. And knowledge like that buys a kind of respect that even hard men can't argue. But I won't pretend it was ever simple, or that the look stopped, or that little bird Thomas he chose when he was grown, though he kept the other name for his mother's use, and his own heart, didn't carry things into his manhood that no cottonwood horse could carve away. What I'll tell you is this, I'm an old man now. The ledger's still on the shelf, my grandfather's and mine, 40 years of every debt and every cost. And there's one entry in it in my own hand, dated the day she came up my road, that I've never crossed out and never balanced and never will, because I've come to understand it was never meant to balance. It says only her name, and under it in the column where the sum should go. Cannot be reckoned, do not try. She's out in the yard now, gray as I am, hanging wash on the same line in no hurry, because we have all the time that's left and no one is coming up the road to take it. And the boy's boy is chasing that deaf dog's great-grandpup around the barn we rebuilt, and there's water in the creek, and I have not opened the accounts in a week. I used to think a life was a thing you kept safe by turning away whatever might cost you. I know better now. A life is only worth the sum of what you were willing to